Dominic Selwood joins me, historian and author of Anatomy of a Nation, A History of British Identity in 50 Documents. Dominic, good to have you on the programme. To the completely uninitiated, people who don't know what the Elgin marbles are, explain it to us.
Yes, with pleasure. So the Elgin marbles were carved in the 5th century BC in Athens to go onto the new building of the Parthenon. Athens had recently beaten the Persians. They were celebrating. And so their leader Pericles built this new temple in Athens and lots of other building things. And on it were these amazing sculptures. Interestingly, actually, the money he used to build it was money that he'd stolen. He should be looking after it for other Greek city-states. So for other Greeks, it wasn't actually a symbol of Greece. It was a symbol of Athenian theft. But these beautiful things were from the 5th century BC. Now, over time, of course, like many classical buildings, it fell into disrepair. It was very badly bombed by the Venetians in the 15th century. The Ottomans, when they conquered Athens, built a mosque inside it. And the Athenians, when they turned it into a church in the 5th century AD, had hacked off a lot of the sculptures because Christians didn't like symbols of pagan gods and goddesses on their buildings. So actually, by the early 1800s, not a lot of it was left. What you see now on the Acropolis in Athens is actually largely a reconstruction from the 1800s and 1900s. In 1800, when Lord Elgin's artists turned up to do drawings and take casts of it, really there was just a shell. It had no roof and most of its walls were gone and most of the pillars had come down. So people need to understand that it's not that Elgin turned up and there was a pristine building. The building was a ruined temple, like many temples of the period were. So Elgin's artists were there to take drawings and casts, which he wanted to bring back to create a school of fine art in Britain to instruct artists in the beauties of classical architecture and sculpture. But realized pretty quickly they were facing ongoing destruction because the Ottomans were hacking bits off and selling them to tourists or grinding them up for mortar or shooting at them with rifles.
In the way that we saw in Syria with
right, absolutely.
Islamic State.
Yeah. And so Elgin asked for permission from the rulers of Athens at the time, who were the Ottomans. It's part of the Ottoman Empire, had been for several centuries. And the Ottomans gave him multiple permissions over a 10-year period to take down these sculptures and export them, both before he did it, during when he was doing it, and after he was doing it. So I think it was, coming back to your comment about Rishi Sunak, it was a really missed opportunity, actually, I think, for Sunak to have tried to take out some of the myths that circulate around all of this, because one of them is that Elgin stole it, and Mitsotakis said that on Sunday on the programme on the BBC. This simply wasn't stolen. There is so much paperwork to show that Elgin did not steal these and had official authorizations. And in fact, in 1816, Parliament held a select committee which looked into it and investigated and said, no, Elgin didn't steal them.
So, I mean, it's hard.
Parliament felt able to buy them and invest them in the British Museum.
Well, you will have seen the documentation, I assume, or parts of it anyway. But it's hard for ordinary Joe Soaps like us to get into the mind of Lord Elgin and what he thought he was doing there. But is your assessment that what he thought he was doing was saving something that would in all likelihood be destroyed if he didn't take it?
Yes, that's what he thought, and it is also the reality. Because if you look at the sculptures that he left there, and it's important to say that when he arrived, half the sculpture had already been destroyed by time. Of the half that remained, he took a quarter and he left a quarter. So the quarter that are in the British Museum are in exceptionally good condition, and we can come on to the quote-unquote cleaning scandal later. But the ones that were left in Athens were left up on the Acropolis very recently, well into this century. And they were very badly damaged by acid rain and pollution from a refinery at nearby Eleusis. So a great example is in the British Museum, there's a horse's head. Comes from the chariot of Selene. And it's very famous because the horse looks absolutely exhausted. You can see its muscles straining, its eyes popping. It looks absolutely tired out because it's been drawing this chariot all day long. In the Acropolis Museum, they have two other of the horses' heads from that same group of horses. And they're unrecognizable. They're just oblongs of stone. There are no features on them at all. You can't even tell they're horses because the acid rain is...
I'm looking at the one in the British Museum now, and it's incredibly detailed, isn't it?
It's one of the favourite exhibits, actually, of all the Elgin marbles in the British Museum. But if you see the ones in Athens, you will see they're unrecognizable. They just look like sort of square shoeboxes or oblong shoeboxes.
And what's happened to them to make them like that? Was that acid rain?
Acid rain, yeah, and pollution. Yeah, left up there for until pretty recently. So the reality is, whatever one thinks about where they should go now, and it's a fair question, and it should be debated. What do we think about culture? Is it national? Is it international? How do we view this? The reality is that were it not for Elgin, we would not have the beauty of Greek sculpture from the Parthenon. And his artists also took plaster casts of all of the ones that were there. including the ones he didn't take. And they kept those. So in the museum in Athens at the moment, there are gaps, but those gaps are not where the marbles are in London, because the plaster casts of Elgin's men were used to fill all the gaps in the Acropolis Museum. So the Acropolis Museum has a full set of real and plaster casts of everything that's known in the world about the Elgin marbles. The gaps are what was already
Are they
gone.
all on display?
They're all on display. Yeah. So you hear tourist guides in the Acropolis Museum saying, and those gaps are where they're in London. That's not true. Whether they're ones in London, there are plaster casts there in Athens.
Well, you've educated me for sure.
Could have.
Yeah, you've educated me on this for sure. I didn't know all of that detail. And so it's since I was a schoolgirl, the Elgin marbles row has been going on, and probably before then as well, I'm sure. What's your best guess as to what's going on with Rishi Sunak here? Would the Foreign Office have been telling him to do it? Was it his own hissy fit about it? Was it his own inability to have a debate about it?
I'm really surprised, to be honest, because Greece began making an issue out of this in the 1970s. Is when it really started. Nothing really much was said before that. Definitely not in Elgin's day or any other time. It started in the 70s, and it's been permanently on the agenda. Every time there's been a meeting between the Greek government and the British government, in the last couple of decades, it's always on the table. It was on the table during Brexit. It was on the table with Boris Johnson. This is completely to be expected. And so it won't have taken the British government in any way by surprise. And in fact, each time it is an opportunity for Britain to say, look, we didn't steal them. They were officially sanctioned by the government at the time.
Here's the paperwork.
So can you stop saying it was stolen?
Yeah.
They weren't destroyed in the process. Actually, they were saved. Elgin saved them. And the only reason we have the lovely ones is because Elgin did bring them. The British Museum looked after them. There was no cleaning scandal in the 1930s, which is what is often said. In fact, the cleaning techniques used by the British Museum were still being used in Greece in the 1950s.
I'm unaware of this cleaning scandal. Tell me about it.
So one of the things that's said is that in the 1930s, the British Museum damaged the sculptures by cleaning them aggressively with abrasive materials. Using wire brushes, which is not the case. Wire brushes weren't used. Using carborundum stone powder to rub, because people loved sculptures to be white. In fact, the Elgin marbles were painted, like most Greek and Roman sculpture was.
More colourful.
They're all fully colourful, and we found traces of colour on them. But for a long time, people liked their Greek and Roman sculpture to be white, so trying to clean it up. And also used copper, because copper is softer than marble, copper chisels, not to hammer at them, but to scrape at dark spots. Now, it's said by many people that this was completely barbaric, shouldn't have been done, outrageous. I mean, there are three things that need to be said about it. One is that curatorial techniques for sculpture or any art changes over the years. I mean, people used to wash Greek and Roman sculptures with sulfuric acid. I mean, people did all sorts of things to them. The one like Michelangelo's David in Florence, exactly the same stuff was done. It's just what was thought was good at the time. And Greece did this actually with steel chisels in the 1950s to the sculptures on Hephaestion, which is the sister temple to the Parthenon. So it's not fair to blame the British Museum for what was then thought of as being normal practice. And secondly, examinations of did it actually cause any damage? I mean, the answer is no. If you go around the Elgin marbles and you look, you couldn't say, well, that one was cleaned and that one wasn't, because there is no difference. People talk about 2 or 3 millimeters of the surface having been removed. It's simply not true.
And can I ask you?
So there are lots of things that are said that aren't right. So Sunak could have taken the opportunity just to say, look, let's have the debate, because it's a good debate to have, but let's just filter out the stuff that's not true, because it's just not a good way to have a debate.
Do you have any sympathy for the Greek Prime Minister's comments about it being like the Mona Lisa being cut in half?
Well, I often hear things like that, or how would Britain feel if, part of Stonehenge was taken away and was in Antwerp or something. The reality is, it's not the same as cutting the Mona Lisa in half. The line that feeds into is that this is a piece of artwork that can only be appreciated all together. And that's not really right, because there are at least 4 different elements of sculpture on the Parthenon. There was the east pediment, there's the west pediment, and they're entirely different pieces of sculpture. There's the metopes, which are the square panels that go all the way around the side, and there are 4 different stories on the different sides. And then there's a completely separate frieze which goes around, which shows the Panathenaic procession.
But they are all of a piece originally, aren't they? In the building. On the building.
As a concept, as a concept, the temple, yes, agreed. But one has to realise, or I think it's important to realise that objects and artifacts move around the world. They always have done, and they always will. If Damien Hirst, made a piece of art today and sold it to Russia or Japan, that would be fine. That's what happens. Things move. And to try and give objects and culture a national identity and a passport, as if it was a person or a company, and say it has to be in this country because it's where it was made, I don't think is a very good thing for humanity to do. It creates nationalism where there shouldn't be any. And what museums are about is showing encyclopedically to the world the wonders of the creativity of humanity. And you can see Egyptian sculpture and Greek sculpture and Indian sculpture all next to each other, and you can see how they interoperated and evolved.
Just
and that's
briefly,
actually a wonderful educational thing.
Briefly, because I do need to go. I do need to let you go. That business of it creates nationalism where there shouldn't be. There is also a legitimate connection to some items, isn't there? I mean, you could argue for Greek Greek attachment to these. You could argue for our attachment to Stonehenge, our attachment to other pieces of art, the findings. The dig in Sutton Hoo and the findings there. We would have something to say if they were bartered away into another part of the world, wouldn't we?
Well, they are, and they have been. So the oldest complete Latin Bible in the world, which is a pretty important cultural object, was actually made in Northumbria in Anglo-Saxon times, and has been in Italy, in Florence, since the Anglo-Saxon period, because the abbot who was taking it, the Pope, died on the way, and that's where it stopped. These things happen. Huge amounts of our culture are abroad. Huge amounts of every country's culture are abroad, and that's just a fact of human existence. And I don't think that Britain has a right to say we need that Bible back, that's ours. History carries things around places. Well, that's part of one of the wonders of it.
It's been so interesting to talk to you. I think if Rishi Sunak ever does meet with the Prime Minister of Greece, he should take you with him. Thank you very much indeed. Good to talk to you, Dominic. Dominic Selwood, historian and author.